Hello everyone! Welcome to the XX Factor. This one's episode 7. The last one ended up being 6.5 because of our time zone madness. And then we had more time zone madness in the week. And apparently the clocks in England and the UK changed last night and I didn't even realise. And Christa was like...
again.
Christa was like, have the clocks changed for you tonight? And I was like, no, definitely not. And then my mum rang up and was like, don't forget the clocks has changed. I was like, oh God. Yeah, so that's cool. Also, another great addition to this podcast is Christa has a new microphone.
Oh yeah, look at me.
So hopefully our sound quality has just upgraded. Please do let us know if you can hear the sound and if everything sounds balanced, because we've had a bit of a fiddle, but hopefully it should be good. Yep, cool. So yes, let's introduce ourselves. So this is the XX Factor, the show where we discuss the gender critical move. Yeah, we need we should do hat coordinated, like little dance moves. This is the show where we talk about the gender critical movement, which is like the PC term for the kind of main anti-trans movement in the UK and now the world. And we discuss the ideas behind it and particularly some of the more crazy views and extreme people. So my name is Katy Montgomerie. I am a trans woman who argues on the internet, and that is my literally only feature, and I no idea why anyone follows me. And this is...
My name is Christa Peterson. I'm a philosopher. My Jack just told me that I'm echoey, so I'm going to try putting in headphones.
Okay, I will also do that. Right. Okay. Hopefully that's better.
Yeah. We'll see. Okay. Is this being shared?
Not yet. You're about to introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Christa. My name is Christa Peterson. I am a philosophy PhD student and also a arguer on the internet.
Cool. Right. So this week, Christa has a really exciting presentation for us all. And we are discussing a couple of the major American people involved in this movement, I guess, who have been in it for a while. So exciting stuff. So yeah, episode 7 for real. The show won't end in 5 minutes time this time.
Okay, Jack says we sound better.
Yay. Okay, wicked. Yeah, headphones probably always make everything better. So.
Cool. Are we
Yep, you're presenting.
Okay, I'm presenting. Okay, so this week we are talking about Jesse Singal or Singal.
We weren't sure. We literally just Googled it and got the robot to say it, and it said it in two different ways.
Yeah. I think I've always thought of it as Singal, so I think I'm going to say that.
Okay, I've always read it as... Well, I've either read it as single or signal because I just can't get the things mixed up, so... I'm probably going to say the wrong thing. Sorry, Jesse, for getting your name wrong, and sorry for nothing else in this episode. Yeah.
But you are just the worst. It's also true. So there was the other week now, this kind of blew up again, as it is wont to do. And Jude Doyle, in their kind of criticism of Substack, which has been kind of collecting different anti-trans voices, at least some of whom it seems like they have given advances to. I think Jesse's not one of those people. I'm not sure about that. But Jude said that they described Jesse as a high-profile supporter of anti-trans conversion therapy. They also said that he was widely known to fixate on and stalk trans women in and around the media industry. Jesse says, "This is really disturbing. He accuses me of supporting conversion therapy, linking to an article that makes no such claim, and of stalking people." I think an underappreciated feature of the rumors around Jesse is that he always amplifies them to like the next level.
Right.
I think that the way I read the stalking thing here is like it's kind of like a loose use of stalking, right? But then when Jesse has been talking about it, it's as though he was accused of like literally like physically
following someone around. Yeah.
People, which I think to him makes the accusation sound ridiculous, but for your information, Jesse, I think it also makes you send worse in people's brains when you keep accusing people of having accused you of these horrible things.
By the way, everyone in chat is saying that it's pronounced single.
Single.
Like the word
Single,
one
just one?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll say that. So Jesse sent this note saying, please delete both these false claims or provide documentation for them. We're going to focus on the first one because that is the one that has the most information in the public domain, which is this claim that Jesse is a supporter of anti-trans conversion therapy. Jesse is pretty regularly portraying himself as like just baselessly being attacked on this point. This is related to this, but it's a subset of online obsessives who have only the foggiest sense exactly of what they're mad about. I would describe my sense of what I'm mad about as like, focused like a laser.
True Christa fashion.
But
well, I guess I can say that most of my understanding just seems to come from he seems to have had some kind of disagreement with most trans women with a profile. And that's like how I know him, from them either, having some public fallout or DMing me something saying something has happened. So mine is more general. So I'm about to learn if this laser focus is true.
Yeah, I mean, the more like repeatedly, at minimum, trans women have not liked the way that he has treated them, and there's been no uptake on that point. Right? It's not. It's just portrayed as these like wild, false accusations, and not that like people found the way he was treating them like degrading and offensive. And but the way he portrays this conversion therapy thing here, he's saying he's adamantly opposed to any kind of reparative therapy, and that's part of why he looks so closely into the Zucker Clinic. Says the Zucker Clinic did not get shut down due to best practice concerns. It got shut down on the basis of false charges that led to the report being yanked from the hospital's website in a lawsuit. He said, so this is a 2015, I think, piece that he did about Zucker getting fired. And he says, the point of that was to look into the accusation that Zucker did, conversion therapy. I found a lot of evidence that those charges were false. JFC, do you not know what journalists do? This is the piece, how the fight over transgender kids got a leading sex researcher fired. So Zucker had...
By Jesse.
By Jesse.
Yeah.
Jesse Singal.
Yes.
Yeah, so Jesse's... So the clear facts are, just to start off, is Zucker was in charge of the children's gender identity clinic at this hospital called CAMH in Toronto, but that was the publicly funded, the one in Ontario that was publicly funded and had trans healthcare. He was fired after kind of like a long-running community concerns about what was going on in his practice. Especially that it was conversion therapy. The way
we actually read out an article the other day on Turf Wars, the last episode, about the experiences of some kid who was involved in this, and it, like, reading the article just at face value, it was horrific. So it's
I will also read it.
Okay.
It's great.
Yeah.
But it just portrays it. These activists had like this totally false impression of what was happening there. It was actually a safe, nurturing environment for young people to explore their emerging gender identities. So he did seemingly find this false claim in. So he was fired. Zucker was fired based on this external report that was conducted. I think Jesse points out correctly that it seems like it was kind of like sloppily conducted. This report, it seems, just looking at the report itself, they say that they had intended to review 16 of the patient charts from the clinic, and they only had time to review 12. It seems it was like at least kind of rushed. And Jesse points to some just kind of like generic errors, like they someone is named Kristen Taylor, and for some reason they call her Kristen Sharp. They get the founding date wrong, just these kind of like general sloppiness things. But then more seriously, one of the kind of flashy allegations in the report was that Zucker had described a patient as a hairy little vermin. And Jesse seemingly would uncover that this was false. And the way he describes it, it like should have been, it should have raised questions from the beginning, because the person who made this accusation, Adam, there were like specific details that were not, that didn't match up with the children's clinic. I think maybe he was describing the adult clinic at CAMH.
Right.
But yeah, so it wasn't like a fabricated allegation, but Jesse got this person to agree that it was probably this other clinician and not Zucker who had said that.
That's not good for CMH though, is it? Like,
yeah.
Oh, it wasn't this guy, it was a different guy who called you a vermin. God.
Yeah. And CAMH, so up until like 2008 or so, they had both an adult and a children's clinic, and the children's one was run by Zucker and the adult one was run by Ray Blanchard. So
what
it's
a
kind
team.
of like, yeah, what a team. It's this like nightmare hospital, right? And so then Jesse portrays this mistake he found, which is like, for Zucker, right, it is bad that he was falsely accused of this. But he portrays it as the most serious allegation in the external review being false. I think this is just not true, as I'll go into. I think it's just a mistake to describe this as the most serious allegation instead of like it's a comment that like, if you heard a clinician make it, you're like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah, there's something wrong if someone's saying that. Yeah.
You cannot speak to the patients like that. But it's not like illegal. It's not kind of like deep and pervasive.
It's not as bad as conversion therapy, if that's the other claim.
Yeah. And so then here, the external review Zucker's allies believe was just a sloppily executed pretense for submitting to political pressure. There was likely a desire on the part of the CAMH administration to close the clinic, and the review was designed to allow them to do just that, wrote Dr. Susan Bradley, who founded the GIC, before handing it over to Zucker. If you read the review, speak with the activists who effectively wrote large swaths of it. So this is part of this is a move that is often made, except where the activists here describes largely other clinicians, just other clinicians. Who's framing that it's like the clinicians versus the activists is just false. Lots of the people who have concerns about it are just other clinicians. There are other clinicians, and they're also like community stakeholders, right? I think especially because of CAMH's prominence and like just their role in Ontario, where people didn't have publicly funded alternatives to it. It's people in the community just were stakeholders, and it wasn't like they're like meddling around in some obscure private clinic, right? This has a big impact.
And I've noticed a wider, like very common gender critical thing to do in general, or even just like a modern anti-trans thing to do, is just to describe all trans people as activists, just like all of them. Because, you know, like bar the 5 who write for The Spectator or whatever, all trans people want like access to healthcare and to go to the toilet. And if they go through, you know, saying, I want those things, then suddenly they're an activist. And then you can say activists versus normal people. And you've like, it's a good framing device. I mean, I couldn't necessarily say that was definitely what's happening here, but, you know, like that's so common.
It's, and this is one of the pieces. The sense you get is like the misinformed mob versus the scientists.
Yeah.
Is very much, the trans activist thing, I try to pay attention to whether people call me this, because I think it's often just a euphemism for calling people trans. And I think at this point, it's like, it'd be pretty accurate to call me a trans rights activist, like in a generic sense, because I do so much, and they rarely, very rarely call me that. Because I'm not trans. It's just
right. I've seen people as well say like all TRAs are men. So that claim to them when they're saying that just means basically all trans women. Here's another word for all trans women that I don't like, which is obviously nonsense. Or then picking random cis women and calling them that too. So,
there is the claim that he's tweeted out that he found lots of evidence that they weren't doing conversion therapy. I find hard to bring into contact with the actual piece. He talks about this allegation, but he would not describe him as disproving it in any substantive way. We hear that GIC clinicians view this as a conceptual error. The critics are conflating sexual orientation, which can't be changed, which is part of the reason we view attempts to mess with it as unethical, and gender identity, which they say isn't some hardwired thing, but is instead formed from a variety of factors. This is just bullshit. This is a totally wacko thing to transcribe. Obviously, their opponents are not making a conceptual mistake and just getting confused about sexual orientation versus gender identity. Their opponents are mostly either trans or clinicians. So people know what they're talking about. They're not simply confused.
No trans people are going in saying sexuality and gender identity are the same. That's like the most common thing you have to debunk as a trans person. So that's pretty ridiculous. Also, like, there's the sneaky claim there that people are born gay, but they're not born trans, which is rubbish.
Yeah, if you look at the last sentence, so Aaron South and Olson Kennedy, who are two gender-affirming clinicians, they think that even young kids have a real gender identity. Jesse says, there isn't any solid scientific evidence to support this view. That doesn't preclude future discoveries, of course. You would think, reading this, that it is on worse empirical grounds than the Zucker Clinic's view, that it's not stable, and it's simply not. We'll talk more about this later. Then Zucker and his colleagues can't even agree with their critics on basic terms and definitions on what a reparative therapy accusation even means in the context of childhood gender identity. Had CAMH decided to investigate this all in an open-minded, careful, scientifically informed way, and had the hospital done so transparently, it would have benefited everyone. That wasn't what happened. So if we want to look at this seriously, I think the first step would be like, so how might we define conversion therapy, right? Would it qualify under those definitions? That is not what happens in this piece. Jesse, I think, does not consider seriously a single, like, coherent definition of conversion therapy and evaluate what was happening at CAMH against that. Instead, he kind of leans on this report, this external report that kind of supposedly was the basis for firing Zucker. And he says that they write, we cannot state that the clinic does not practice reparative approaches, if not outright therapies. They don't bother to explain how reparative therapy would even be defined in this context, which seems crucial given the bedrock debate over gender identity development. But we can try to define this. And I think it's like quite, I do not know of a coherent definition of conversion therapy that would exclude what they were doing at CAMH, unless you are exclusively restricting it to sexual orientation, which clearly the people saying this are not. They mean gender identity conversion therapy. Zucker's explanations of why he wasn't doing conversion therapy. In this article, people suggested that the treatment was analogous to conversion therapies. Zucker says, I think the analogy is flawed because it confounds the timing of the intervention. In general, I'm sympathetic to the perspective that sexual orientation, particularly in men, is largely stable by adulthood. This is a weak defense, right? It's like, it seems to be rejecting the idea that you can do sexual orientation conversion therapy to kids either. It's like, this is just about adults. But yeah,
I mean, they do it to kids, and it's bullshit. Sexuality conversion therapy on children is probably like the most common form of it, so it's horrible. Also, I don't know that, like, the particularly in men comment is just a little like I noticed that lots of these like sexologists will say things like like, oh, women, do we even know if women have sexualities or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of like evolutionary psychologists, right? I think they're like not literally, but the vibe is similar.
Yeah.
The way Jesse talks in like the way he approaches this piece, you might think that like 1980s sexology and this kind of psychology was like the pinnacle of science, and it was not. It was wacky.
Total bogus nonsense. Yeah.
Yes. And so this is after Zucker was fired. He did get a settlement from the hospital because of this false accusation that they posted this report on their website saying that he had called a patient a hairy little vermin, and so he got $500,000, a lot of money. But
what the fuck? That is a lot of money.
But how much money? He was probably earning a ton of money from them, just like yearly.
Yeah.
But so in this, his defense is the term has been inappropriately expropriated from the way it is used to critique clinicians who were treated mainly adult homosexual men who didn't want to be gay. So I object strenuously to using that term when we're talking about young children who have gender dysphoria.
So it's basically saying like, yeah, I'm doing the same thing, but on different people, so it doesn't count.
Yeah. I mean, the
which
defense,
is like...
And so this is just note how... So you see what Jesse just kind of like credulously repeated in his piece, where they say that people are conflating gender identity and sexual orientation. They say a lot. Like Blanchard says this, Zucker says this. It's kind of a line which is like, you're conflating this. And I think it's...
This is what they're talking about. It's about conflating they're saying you're conflating it because you're saying both these things are conversion therapy, when all I'm trying to do is stop trans people from being cis. I mean, from being trans.
But again, no one is conflating it. They just think they are relevantly similar.
Yeah.
That's the claim. Here from Jesse, there's a mystery tweet in here, but he says there's zero evidence Zucker tried to convert anyone. None. Zilch. And someone says something. And he says, people who arrived at the office already having socially transitioned and were transitioned back. And then he says, GIC policy was if a kid showed up having already socially transitioned, they didn't touch that. So it seems like he has a definition of anti-trans conversion therapy where it's literally taking someone who has transitioned already and detransitioning them. This is not a... This is like saying that conversion therapy only counts against gay men if they're like already having... If
they're already married or something.
Yeah, like... Yeah.
So to be clear, like that would be a form of conversion therapy, and it is a form of conversion therapy that goes on today, in fact, and perhaps a guest we might have in the future might have a lot to say about that, because there are a few like ex-detrans people who detransition for political reasons and like as a form of conversion therapy. But yeah, you're right that it's not even remotely exclusive to that, because it could even be, I mean, it's just anyone. It could be someone who hasn't even begun transition or hasn't even come out yet to themselves and goes in asking questions and then has some kind of thing forcing them to be a cis person. And then that itself is then just conversion therapy. So it doesn't matter whether someone is out or not or whether they transitioned or not.
Yeah, especially for kids, this would make it like almost all conversion therapy not count as conversion therapy because with young kids, but basically if they're young enough, like only can fully transition if with parental support, and then also are only getting conversion therapy on their parents' initiative. So you would have to have like a weird little parent switcheroo to have this sense,
right.
Which is, and what we see from so this is a U.S. Agency administration, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. What they say, this is from 2015 October, so this was out when Jesse was working on this. But they say conversion therapy, efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, is a practice that is not supported by credible evidence and has been disavowed by behavioral health experts.
Interestingly, or gender expression in there.
Yeah, that is actually, I think is a good, I think that's been like left out of some of the bans on conversion therapy, but I think is good to include for reasons well.
Right, yeah.
But they acknowledge historically conversion therapy efforts to make children's behaviors, dress, and mannerisms more consistent with those stereotypically expected of their assigned sex at birth were the primary clinical approach used with children experiencing gender dysphoria. Citation, Zucker, 2004. efforts to change children's gender expression have been made with the goal of preventing a transgender identity. And then they go on to say, no research has been published in the peer-reviewed literature that demonstrates the efficacy of conversion therapy efforts. In addition to the lack of evidence for conversion therapy, there are concerns about the ethics of the practice, as well as the potential for harm. At the time, 2015, there wasn't specific research showing harms of conversion therapy on gender minority youth. They say the harms that people have in mind are suggested by clinicians' observations that the behavioral issues and psychological distress of many children and adolescents with gender dysphoria improves markedly when their gender identities and expressions are affirmed through transition. There actually now is specific evidence about the harms of this kind of conversion therapy. So in this paper by Jack Turbin and some other people, they find that exposure to gender identity conversion therapy, which they define as like trying to make the child identify with their sex assigned at birth before 10 years, was significantly associated with several measures of suicidality, including lifetime suicide attempts. In 2017, a bunch of UK organizations published this memorandum of understanding on conversion therapy, where they define it as a therapeutic approach that demonstrates an assumption that any sexual orientation or gender identity is inherently preferable to any other, and which attempts to bring about a change of sexual orientation or gender identity.
Just worth cutting in on here. So this is quite a general way they phrased it, and that's the best way to do it because you want to cover everything. They've said any attempt which tries to make one gender identity or sexuality seem preferable to another is what this is about. So that obviously includes trying to make trans children into cis children or trans people into cis people, and also includes trying to make lesbian, gay, and bisexual people into straight people. But it also does very clearly include the idea of forcing a cis person to be trans and a straight person to be gay, which we all know, potentially has happened more than once in human history, but is not like a thing. Like conversion therapy of LGBT people is widespread across the world and is horrific and happens like every single day. And like some kind of hypothetical conversion therapy on cis or heterosexual people just doesn't happen, as in it doesn't happen. Even if you can find one example of it one time happening in 1841 or whatever, that doesn't mean it's the thing that's happening. The reason I'm bringing this up is because a ban on conversion therapy would ban if someone said there are loads of people forcing people to be trans, a ban on conversion therapy would ban that. And I would support that because anyone who's forcing someone to be trans or gay is committing just as evil an act as trying to force a gay or trans person into being straight or cis. But it's interesting that certain political groups in the UK, gender critical groups like LGBT Alliance, are opposing a ban on conversion therapy. And their claim is that they don't want cis children being forced trans, which, it's the classic just bullshit that all the anti-gay people said and always say about bans on anti-gay conversion therapy. That they're opposing something which covers the example they're trying to use to justify them opposing it, which is just garbage. It just doesn't make any sense. And it just relies on people not being experts and not understanding this and just having a fear of the idea of people being forced to be LGBT, which doesn't happen. Anyway, sorry, a little detour there. I think that's quite an important way of highlighting. Like, look how many organisations are in on this, including the NHS, by the way. Anyway.
An interesting thing related to that. So it's not included here, but one of the points they make in this is they specifically say that gender confirmation treatments are not conversion therapy under this. They're just any kind of, they don't automatically qualify. And Transgender Trend has a report about like the institutional capture of this report being signed. And in it, they start up by being like, why did they have this claim that like gender confirmation isn't conversion therapy? And on like page 3 of the report, we find out that while they were preparing this, Transgender Trend kept sending them letters claiming that it was conversion therapy. And so that, I believe, is why they specified it was not.
This is such a classic gender critical strategy. There's some journalists in the UK who sent a complaint to some trans organisation or the NHS or something, and then wrote a report saying complaints have been sent and they're not addressing the complaints. And then they addressed the complaints and they said, oh, this isn't actually a thing. But they got their article out of it and they were like, oh, anonymous expert complaints have been sent, and they were sent by themselves. So, Transgender Trend must have also known that they were sending this and creating the pressure in order to then set up this idea that, oh, look, isn't this suspicious that they've specifically said the one thing we're talking about? Fuck off.
Yeah. Here, sort of this person, so British Psychoanalytic Council was just one of the signatories. This fan person on Twitter said, hi, does this include what was practiced at Ken Zucker's clinic? And the British Psychoanalytic Council says, yes. And the person says, is that your opinion or everyone who signed this? And they say, all of us. And Jesse Singal retweets this and says, yikes, British Psychoanalytic Council jumps on the Zucker equal conversion therapy bandwagon.
The experts jumping on the bandwagon of diagnosing something.
At this point, I think it is just straightforward that Jesse Singal is being disingenuous when he repeatedly tells these claims that it's like, when have I ever supported conversion therapy? He knows that many informed people consider this conversion therapy. I will argue it quite clearly is by normal definitions, but he knows this is not like a vague, confused thing that people have.
Activists.
He knows that many people. So we will look at. I put so much text in this. Okay, but we're going to look at Zucker's method according to Zucker's publications mostly, and then also what Michael Bailey says. So Michael Bailey also is a student of Ray Blanchard. These people are all very closely connected academically.
I thought they were.
Not,
so we had a good tweet from Michael Bailey in Tough Wars this week of him saying, female sexuality, if it even exists. And this was like 2018. It's like, we've known for a long time that women have sexuality, thanks.
So I just want to note, this is as of 1990. This is a piece by Zucker and Susan, what's her last name? I will get her last name on a later publication where she says, and Susan something, about what they were doing at the clinic. And in this, when they're talking about the treatment goals for treatment with the time, basically all of the time Zucker's writing, he's writing about gender identity disorder and not gender dysphoria. But they say the therapist needs to closely consider the goals of treatment. Two short-term goals have been discussed in the literature: the reduction or elimination of social ostracism and conflict in the alleviation of underlying or associated psychopathology. Longer-term goals have focused on the prevention of transsexualism and or homosexuality.
Oh, God, that's very explicit. When was this? Sorry?
This is 1990.
Okay, yeah, well.
So they say in the clinical literature, there's been little disagreement about the advisability of preventing gender dysphoria. When they say this, when they say preventing gender dysphoria, they mean preventing the gender identity. They don't. Is now with the way people conceptualize it now, you could theoretically have a transgender identity and yet not have the emotional consequences that is required for the diagnosis, but that they don't mean that. It's just repeatedly quite clear that the way that they are using this is when they say the prevention of gender dysphoria, they mean the prevention of gender identity. And say, not surprisingly, however, the development of a heterosexual orientation is probably preferred by most parents of children with GIDC, that's gender identity disorder in children. It's important, therefore, that clinicians point out that as of yet, there is no strong evidence either way as to the effectiveness of treatment on later sexual orientation. They say that their preference is to emphasize the merit of reducing childhood gender identity conflict per se. So it's it's a little too cute when then years later they're like, you think what we're doing is conversion therapy? When it's but you thought it might work as anti-gay conversion therapy. You were wondering. By 1995, they seem convinced that it doesn't work for sexual orientation. But just because there's so much that's about the desistance studies. I was very struck. So the desistance studies are the studies that show that the children diagnosed with gender identity disorder, and just the way that the diagnosis worked, they could either actually be identifying in this way, or they could just have like a wish to be of the other gender. Most of those children, according to these studies, are gay in adulthood and not trans.
So this is, you've said there, a diagnosis at the time of gender identity disorder, or whatever the disorder name was at the time. But is that actually the case? Because I know at least one of the studies I've read, it has those people, and then it also has like other people who are just like referred, and it has people including like kids who have just worn different clothes, and then their parents have panicked and they brought them in, and then they've grown up to be cis kids, cis adults, and then they're like, desistance, and it's just there was never a diagnosis or even a claim of being trans in the first place.
Yeah, so I think at least the Davida Singh, who was a Zucker PhD student, has a dissertation research, is one of these desistance studies that hasn't been published. But I think hers is focused on people who actually had a gender identity disorder diagnosis. But I think from reading the publications of their group, I think you might think that they were being quite liberal, these diagnoses. But so here they say, when all the clinical signs are present, it's not difficult to make the diagnosis. Sorry, this is kind of small. Clinical experience suggests, however, that one must also be sensitive to the psychological problems experienced by youngsters who display muted versions of the full clinical picture. Boys in this more ambiguous zone do poorly in male peer groups, avoid rough and tumble play, are disinclined towards athletics and other conventionally masculine activities, and feel somewhat uncomfortable about being male. However, these boys do not wish to be girls and do not show an intense preoccupation with femininity. Friedman coined the term juvenile unmasculinity to describe such boys who, he argued, suffer from a persistent, profound feeling of masculine inadequacy, which leads to a negative valuing of the self. It's not clear whether this behavior pattern actually constitutes a distinct syndrome or is simply a mild form of gender identity disorder in children. In any case, the residual diagnosis, gender identity disorder, not otherwise specified, could be employed in such cases. This does not obviously sound like a syndrome at all, right? Do these kids have any kind of psychological problem? Not in this description.
Some boys don't like sports. They say, by middle childhood, the presence of effeminate vocal and motor traits in boys, such as a high-pitched voice and exaggerated dorsiflexion of the wrist. But that is actually this, but I think they need this. I don't think this is like a thing people do. Often results in severe peer ostracism. Chronic peer conflicts and social ostracism often lead school authorities to recommend clinical referral. Right? So this is like a little off topic, but I was just very struck in reading this, like because these desistance studies are made so much of that, like here it just seems like they're like sucking up a ton of kids that are like. Feminine. Yeah, they're kind of saying like, oh, send those limp wrist boys in for a gender conversion. Like, what are you on about?
And this is, it's one of the, so like, so if you define conversion therapy, like anti-gay conversion therapy, as just trying like in your brain intentionally to change someone's sexual orientation, I think they like weren't doing that after at least 1995, if ever. But I think it would be reasonable to think of anti-gay reparative therapy in a more general sense, or would also include things that like just in fact target gay kids and like seek to masculinize their gender presentation. Yeah. And according to Zucker, most of the kids he's doing this on grow up to be gay. So it's just not the idea that we can make this like hard distinction between gender identity conversion therapy, sexual orientation conversion therapy. I think it's just kind of challenged by what they're doing, which was, it seems like, in fact, like directly like trying to masculinize all of these gay kids and make them more gender normative.
They often, this is a very common gender critical argument strategy overall, is to simultaneously pretend that trans people are just like very gay people, like they're just confused lesbians, they're just really gay men. They'll say that one thing and they'll almost say trans people don't exist. They often do say trans people don't exist. They're just gay people and fetishists as the two options. And like historically, that's the way that people did view trans people. Like, for example, in the Weimar Republic in the 30s, before the Nazis got in and killed everyone, that's kind of how they viewed trans people, as just like a form of gay person. And, you know, that's just like a common societal thing even today. But so they'll push that idea, but then they'll like simultaneously say that conversion therapy for these two things are totally different. And you know, we can't conflate the two. There's nothing to do with trans and gay people. They have no common interests. It's like, you think they're the same people, and you're also saying they're completely different. And it's like, if you're like the where this all comes from, like the pressure to force people into boxes, it isn't like, oh, I have recognized this person's internal attraction to other people is to the wrong people. I mean, that is a part of it, but it also comes along with all of the stereotypes, and it comes along with the like the rule breaking that comes with being gay and being in the wrong relationship and not having a family, and all, like, there's so many aspects to conversion therapy against any LGBT person. So this is definitely covered in this. Like, if you pick up a load of gay kids or just feminine boys or like camp people, and you're like, right, we're not going to change their sexual orientation, don't worry, we're just going to force them to talk and act like real men and have real men interests, like, that's, you're still targeting, you know, you're still trying to change who people are. It's still wrong, it's still immoral, and also we all know that sexuality is the driver for that kind of targeted bullshit. But
Florence Ashley, who is, I don't know what her discipline is, but she works on conversion therapy related things, and she prefers the term reparative therapy. And I think in cases like this, it kind of makes more sense just term-wise, because it's not like necessarily gay kids are literally trying to be converted to a different sexual orientation, but they're being viewed as though there's something wrong with them.
They're trying to fix them.
It's trying to fix, even if what they're trying to fix now is like their gender expression or something, and not like literally convert them to a different sexuality. It's still is this kind of like reparative way of thinking.
Forcing someone into a box. I mean, that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's like, you had these genitals, so you must think, act, and do in this way. That's the whole concept behind anti-LGBT conversion therapy.
So the definitions of conversion therapy that we see in mainstream position statements by experts, like conversion therapy efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, or this one, which is a reparative therapy, which attempts to change one's sexual orientation or gender identity. And this one, which is any kind of approach that assumes that one gender identity is inherently preferable. Just what the Zucker Group describes in their publications, I mean, very straightforwardly falls under these descriptions. So there's two main places where they really go through in depth their approach that is like up to reasonably current, I assume, which is this 2008 piece, Children with Gender Identity Disorder, is their best practice, where Zucker says, like, I would argue is as legitimate to want to make youngsters comfortable with their gender identity, is to make it correspond to the physical reality of their biological sex, as it is to make youngsters comfortable with their ethnic identity, to make it correspond with the physical reality of the color of their skin. The age at assessment, they target when they're doing these interventions with kids based on their belief that children's gender identities are more flexible when they're young. The reason for giving this treatment specifically to young kids is not because they are necessarily in immediate need of psychological help. It's because they think it's malleable in them. It says, there's greater plasticity and opportunity for change in younger children than in older children. We certainly see this narrowing of plasticity or malleability amongst adolescents who present with gender identity concerns. It's akin to a sensitive period for gender identity formation. And then the way he describes their approach, there's kind of three facets. They treat it in the naturalistic environment, they treat the parents, they treat the child. Where
the parents.
We'll talk about this. This is a concern feature, I think, of this. But the naturalistic environment treatment is promotion of same-sex peer relations, encouragement of gender-typical and neutral activities, and limit setting of cross-gender behaviors. So it's, from a psychoeducational point of view, one rationale for limit setting is that if parents allow their child to continue to engage in cross-gender behavior, the gender identity disorder is in effect being tolerated, if not reinforced. Another rationale for limit setting is that it is, in effect, an effort to alter the gender identity disorder from the outside in.
That's quite, I mean, this is so explicitly conversion therapy. Like,
yes.
It's just like, it's just like writing down how to do a conversion therapy. We're going to force the kids to do what we want.
They're like a little cutesy about it at times. It's like both very explicit, and then they're like a little like, oh, I'm like not quite out saying it, but they are saying it, right? Susan Bradley, that's her name. So this is a 2012 paper. So the clinic was closed in 2015. So this is the description of just what they were doing then, right? There's like no significant time gap between when this was published. And they say it describes the approach used at the CAMH clinic. They say, if the parents are clear in their desire to have their child feel more comfortable in their own skin, that is, they would like to reduce their child's desire to be of the other gender, the therapeutic approach is organized around this goal. The comfortable in their own skin is a euphemism. Right? As Zucker himself talks about in some of his publications, many of these young children, they don't have, particularly have like bodily dysphoria at this age because they're so small. And it's just what they mean by feeling comfortable in their own skin is having a gender identity that's congruent with their biological sex. It's not it's just that.
Yeah.
When he says, on what basis is it decided that treatment is indicated? And then what they describe here is basically the basis for deciding whether the gender identity can be changed. So is gender identity fixed and unalterable in childhood? This is weird. And he would say, for the vast majority of children, probably, as they mean just like cis children. For most children, no one tries to alter their gender identity after it is first expressed for a host of psychological and other reasons. And they say, for children who present clinically with a diagnosis of gender identity disorder, long-term follow-up studies suggest that their gender identity is not necessarily fixed. And that this is their main, repeatedly, the evidence they present for thinking that they can change children's gender identities is this desistance stuff, which is troubling given what we talked about. It's just not, if you don't do anything to these kids, they grow up and many of them aren't trans. And the idea that saying this means that you can change it, there's just not a basis for it, right? But then they say, based on this, one could argue that the childhood gender identity was alterable. There was plasticity and malleability. And they go on to explain how they think about how this can be changed. And they say, in our case formulation, parental neutrality or encouragement of cross-gender behavior is viewed as a perpetuating factor. And so in general, in their approach, they think if parents accept their child's cross-gender behavior, they are making them trans, basically. And so a central part of the approach is stopping that parental neutrality or encouragement of it.
So, I mean, this is, again, like the gender critical movement love all this stuff. Like, this is what, like, a huge, maybe even like half of their entire thing is focused around. And it's all about stopping children from, presenting in a way that doesn't match their genitals. It's all about stopping young boys from playing with dolls and wearing dresses and stuff and the young girls from, doing the opposite, it's like literally just gender role reinforcement. I mean, it couldn't be any more explicitly is the opposite of critical of gender. If you're critical of gender and your kid likes playing with whatever toys, then you would just be like, these aren't girls' toys, these aren't boys' toys, these are just toys, and you should be able to play with any of them, and I'll get you all of them. I don't want you to just have dolls, or I don't want you to just have, I don't know what boys play with. But like, that would be the kind of, I'm critical of the institution of gender roles, whereas this is all about, enforcing them. That's like the whole explicit thing. That's the whole focus of this. And for them to come in and say they're critical of gender is just utter hypocritical garbage.
Yeah, so in this psychotherapy side of things, they talk about how they tell kids, like, just because you like playing with dolls doesn't make you a girl. You can do all this stuff.
True.
But it is kind of hard to reconcile, like, what that means to kids on the ground when they're also having all of their toys taken away for not matching their biological sex. It's like, oh yeah, this doesn't make you a.
It's hypocritical. Toys. Yeah, it's like, oh, well, boys can play with dolls, but boys can't play with dolls. Like,
you can't play with dolls.
Dolls are for vagina children only. It's disgusting.
Yeah. So then they were asked by whoever organized this volume to look at the question is prevention of adult transsexualism a reasonable treatment goal? And they say, here we can pose an ancillary question to illustrate in part the centrality of social values. Is prevention of homosexuality a reasonable treatment goal? On this point, most secular clinicians would answer no. In our own clinic, we've never advocated for the prevention of homosexuality. At the same time, we're sensitive to the fact that some parents bring their child to the clinic in part because they're worried that their child will grow up to be gay or lesbian. Over the years, our approach has been a psychoeducational one and also a pragmatic one. We explain to the parents that there are no empirical studies that suggest that alteration of a child's gender identity will also alter their eventual sexual orientation, that homosexuality per se is not considered a mental disorder. See, that gay men and lesbians can lead productive and satisfying lives. The implied contrast here, right, is with being a trans adult. And they say, in our experience, the majority of parents are satisfied with this psychoeducational approach. Many parents that we work with do not have a particular problem if their child were to grow up gay or lesbian. Many of these parents do, however, hold the aspiration that they would like their child to be comfortable in his or her own skin. In other words, they can see that growing up transsexual or transgender may augur a more complicated life. And they say, although we do not have a particular quarrel with the prevention of transsexualism as a treatment goal, we believe that this should be contextualized. If a child grew up comfortable in their own skin, but was generally miserable, one could hardly argue with unabashed enthusiasm for the prevention of transsexualism. Weirdly equivocal on that, I think. Their normal just is like, we don't think like that it's just intrinsically bad to be trans. We think it's like so hard on the children. We're trying to prevent it. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's still trying to prevent it. Oh.
Yes. But then they can't even come out and say, like, obviously, if this made kids miserable, even if it made them not trans, you should not do it. It's just, you couldn't argue with unabashed enthusiasm for it. What are you talking about? Why are you being like that? It's so weird.
Yeah, like, well, we've stopped them being trans and ruined their life at the same time. I'm not super enthusiastic about that, but,
Unabashedly enthusiastic.
Yeah, like, I'm enthusiastic, but not, like, I will be quiet sometimes about how enthusiastic I am.
And then we just get another kind of description in Michael Bailey's book about this. I won't read this whole thing because it's just the same. But it's, again, he was like interviewing Zucker, and he is sympathetic to this approach. This is not one of the evil activist detractors that Jesse has to defend him against. And according to Zucker says simply, the Barbies have to go. Feminine toys and accoutrements, including Barbie dolls, girl shoes, dresses, purses, and princess gowns, are no longer to be tolerated at home, much less bought for the child. Zucker believes toleration and encouragement of feminine play and dress prevents the child from accepting his maleness. Common sense says that if a boy wants to play with dolls so much that he's willing to risk his father's wrath and his peers' scorn, it's unlikely to change his behavior due to inconsistent feedback, sometimes forbidding, sometimes tolerating, and sometimes even encouraging it. Inconsistent parenting like this is ineffective in stamping out any kind of unwanted behavior.
Stamping out unwanted behavior.
Yes.
That's disgusting.
Just works like you would imagine in practice. Tay Meadow has a book called Trans Kids that was based in part on interviews and visits of Zucker's clinic before it was closed. There's a chapter called The Gender Clinic. It says, most CAMH parents I met came in times of desperation. They arrived at the clinic distraught with children who were struggling socially, academically, and personally. Most families engaged, at least for a time, in efforts to re-socialize their children into more normative gender behavior. At the suggestion of Ken or one of the clinic's other psychologists, parents would remove some of the child's cross-gender toys and clothing and replace them with gender-neutral or male-coded objects. 2 parents said that their children seemed to take these decisions in stride. The dominant narrative, however, was one of pain and struggle. Sabrina remembered her initial months at CAMH as terrible. She and her husband, Charlie, brought then kindergarten-age Lucian to CAMH after he was physically assaulted on the playground by a group of 10-year-old boys for playing with a Barbie doll. Apart from his obvious femininity, Lucian struggled to relate to other children. He started fights, had frequent emotional outbursts, and seemed generally unhappy. They felt desperate to find some way to help him connect. Sabrina characterized the first year of treatment as probably the most traumatic thing I think we went through as a family. At Ken's suggestion, she and Charlie began to systematically remove the female-coded toys Lucian had, along with his costumes, wigs, and dolls. For a while, she said, he was utterly miserable. He would beg, please can I have just one more doll? Please, just one more doll. He began stealing toys from classmates and from stores. He would hide them in his room, and when asked where he got them, lie and say he found them. Sabrina said denying him those things felt awful, particularly because his older brother was able to get the toys he wanted. It didn't seem fair. She wondered if it was even cruel. For the first 6 months to a year under Ken's care, Lucian had trouble sleeping. His volatility and difficulty with peers continued. Sabrina complained to Ken that she felt what she was doing was mean, that they were denying Lucian things that made him feel good, that they would never fully neutralize his environment anyway, since he continued fashioning towels into long hair and dresses. Ken told her to give it time, that the point was to help him have more normal social relationships. Sabrina said, this is probably the only reason that Charlie and I continue, is that I don't believe that anyone could ever really change him ever. It was just about trying to make him happier. So it wasn't about trying to change him and make him a man's man. It was literally about trying to help his social skills and make him happier. The whole idea of having some measure of self-esteem around being a boy, and that there's nothing bad because he did behave as if being a girl is the best thing ever. And so the way Dr. Zucker posed it to us was that we want to find out from him is what it is about being a girl that he thinks is so much better. You know, what it is that we can help him still feel those things, experience those things without hating who he is. Because that was my biggest fear, that he would go through adolescence hating his body.
This is just so disgusting. Like, what do you think is going to make someone hate themselves more? Like taking away everything that they have in their life, like a child taking away their toys and their clothes, and when they're begging, and you think that's going to stop them from hating themselves. It's just disgusting. And this, like, oh, we're trying to get them to like get on with their peers better. Like, the reason that they're not getting on with their peers is because you're treating them like shit. Like, trans kids can get on with their peers fine. Like, you know, trans people have in a world where trans people are all societal outcasts, because that's all you've ever seen on the TV, then you might have some kind of vague argument, even though it's kind of bullshit. Like, trans people can have friends. I've got loads of friends. And, you know, so can trans kids. Loads of trans kids just fit in fine with their peers because they just fit in with their peers once you let them, rather than trying to force them to fit in with the wrong ones. Sorry, I'm sure you haven't remotely finished on this, but this is just so disgusting.
It seems some trans kids need social help, right? But like the idea that taking away all of their toys is a kind of social help, that is not something like that. Why would that be a like first pass intervention for them? It's just not. That's not.
There's so many ways of helping people with this social help. Like, if the kid doesn't fit in and also happens to be showing all the signs of gender dysphoria, then there's so many ways you can teach them how to fit in with their friends that aren't anything to do with gender dysphoria. Ugh, God.
So this is like a NPR. This is probably one of the most widely known anecdotes of
Yeah, this is the one that I
these
talked
kids.
about.
And it also starts with
This is
Christa's
horrible.
mother seeking help when her child was assaulted on a playground. And so whenever Zucker encounters a child younger than 10 with gender identity disorder, he tries to make the child comfortable with the sex he or she was born with. So to treat Bradley, Zucker explained to Carol that she and her husband would have to radically change their parenting. Bradley would no longer be allowed to spend time with girls. Note this in relation to the idea that it's trying to help their social lives. Their social lives
taking away their friends. Well, so when they say help with their social lives, they mean help with the social life that I have imagined for my child, who I think is a boy. So help them get on with boys. So like in the previous, if in this example we're talking about a trans girl who is forced to having their friends taken away from them, and that's described as fitting in socially, then in that previous case where they said they weren't getting on with their peers, they probably meant their male peers rather than their female ones. So like it's all just sorry.
Yeah, no, again, it's the same kind of restrictions where he's no longer allowed to play with girlish toys or pretend he's a female character. Zucker said that these activities were dangerous to a kid with gender identity disorder. He explained that unless Carol and her husband helped the child to change his behavior, as Bradley grew older, he likely would be rejected by both peer groups. Boys would find his feminine interests unappealing. Girls would want more boyish boys. Bradley would be an outcast. Carol resolved to do his best. Still, these were huge changes. By the time Bradley started therapy, he was almost 6 years old, and Carol had a house full of Barbie dolls and Polly Pockets. She now had to remove them. To cushion the blow, she didn't take the toys all away at once. She told him that he could choose one or two a day.
That alone is just imagine your parents as a child saying, we're going to take away one of your toys every day. Like, and you have to choose your favorites. That would have broken me as a kid. Because I felt really bad about having favorite toy. I had loads of little cuddly toys, like a toy fish and a toy penguin and stuff. And I used to tell them all that they were equals because I felt bad about picking a favorite. If I had to pick a least favorite, that would have broken me. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, no, I think that children's toys are very important to them. It's not, they're just so important to them. These kids are so small. But as his pile of toys dwindled, Carol realized Bradley was hoarding. She would find female action figures stashed between couch pillows. Rainbow unicorns were hidden in the back of Bradley's closet. Bradley seemed at a loss, she said. They gave him male toys, but he chose not to play at all. He turned to coloring and drawing, and he just simply wouldn't play with anything. And he would color and draw for hours and hours. And that would be all he did in a day, Carol said. And I think he was really lost. The whole way that he knew and understood how to play was just sort of removed from his house. His drawings also proved problematic. Bradley would populate his pictures with the toys and interests he no longer had access to: princesses, fairies, rainbows of pink and purple and pale yellow. So under Zucker's direction, Carol and her husband sought to change this as well. They would ask him, "Can you draw a boy for us?" And then he didn't really want us to see his drawings or watch him drawing because we would always say, "Can you draw a boy?" And then finally, after, I don't know, a month or two, he just said, "Mom, I don't know how to draw a boy." Carol says she finally sat down and showed him. From then on, Bradley drew boys as directed. Male figures with anemic caps of hair on their heads filled the pages of his sketchbook.
It's just breaking a child. It's just getting them and stamping on their personality and who they are. Like it's just so clearly mistreatment. I don't know how anyone could describe this differently.
Jesse acknowledges this case in the piece, though he portrays it as an outlier rather than, I think the reality is it's a very straightforward.
Why would this be an outlier?
Method. And then he says that Carol now is very grateful for Zucker. She thinks this intervention was great. And she says that she feels that the NPR piece left out that this was based on him being too obsessed with the toys and having trouble forming social relationships. But again, this is just not a straightforward social intervention. It's so nebulous. Like, oh, we'll take away all his toys and then he'll have to learn how to play with other toys and then he'll be more socially competent. It's just not the kind of intervention.
Also, where's the follow-up when this kid is now 26 or whatever? Like, Let's see if they've come out.
Yeah, so at the when Jesse wrote his piece, it's presented as Bradley is now a gay 13-year-old, which is like it's for, because I think Zucker was treating that is like true, right? But it's like why are we doing any of this? Jesse says in his piece, parents were sometimes encouraged to tweak family tendencies and habits that could be contributing to their child's distress, which ruffled some feathers. This is just so euphemistic to what is actually happening.
Taking away their friends and toys is not tweaking tendencies and habits.
Tweaking family tendencies, right?
Yeah, buying toys for your child that they like, letting them play, letting them just like I feel like taking away friends and toys is like unforgivably bad, like it's disgusting, but just to then make them draw what you want them to draw is like taking away their imagination. It's like the one place that you can always go, no matter how bad your life gets, is your imagination, and they're like crushing that out too. It's just harrowing.
This is another, I think, very disturbing feature of this that is just right there in Zucker's publications. This again is the 2008 piece and the 2012 piece. So I read the part where they say if parents are clear that what they want is to limit their child's cross-gender behavior, then treatment is centered around that. What happens if that's not what the parent wants is less clear, and it often seems to be making the parent want that. So a disturbing feature of these cases is both that I think both of them involve significant convincing. And a central part of what Zucker does with the treatment is that he's having these like weekly meetings with parents to help them implement these interventions because they just feel awful about it. You see all these parents that are just like miserable doing this because the kid is miserable.
They're hurting their child and they're saying, keep going.
Yes.
Like,
and they need all this feedback, right? Because like what they're seeing at home in their family is that it's wrong, right? And it's this like, for some parents for whom instituting such changes is done without ambivalence or reservation, less attention is needed to the particulars of the intervention. For other parents, however, in which the child's gender identity difficulties are embedded in a great deal of ambivalence, the focus of the sessions can be to explore the underlying dynamics. I'm going to read a case example now that involves a description of sexual assault. So just giving a warning. Katy, can you remember to wave when I'm done in case anyone wants to mute us and then unmute us when I...
Right, okay. Yep, I will do a wave like this when we're done, and also I'll put something in the description, putting the timestamps.
So see, he says, in these cases, the therapeutic work is much more complex, challenging, and long-term. Case example. Harry was a 4-year-old boy with an IQ of 121. He had an older brother and lived with his parents, who were of lower middle-class background. At the time of his assessment, his parents were about to separate. During Harry's life, his parents' relationship had deteriorated as a result of many issues, including an affair on the father's part, multiple disagreements about lifestyle and parenting issues, and mother's deteriorating psychiatric state, which had required inpatient treatment after a suicide attempt when Harry was around 18 months old. Harry had displayed signs of cross-gender behavior since the age of 2, including compulsive and frantic cross-dressing and the verbalized desire to become a girl. His mother expressed marked ambivalence about treating Harry's GID. This is who he is. If I tell him not to, I will destroy his basic essence. Exploration of the mother's life history revealed many reasons for her ambivalence around men and masculinity. She had grown up in a family in which her father was largely absent. She had been gang raped at the age of 13, following which she developed a severe eating disorder, and in her relationship with her husband, had found sexual intimacy increasingly aversive. For Harry's mother, fantasy aggression was equated with real aggression, and she worried that if such behavior was encouraged in Harry, he would develop into a rapist. Apart from the mother's ambivalence about masculinity, she also enjoyed Harry's feminine side. He would often brush her hair and bring her tea when she was depressed and bedridden. Thus, there was suggestive evidence that Harry took care of her mother, and that in her mind, there was the risk of losing Harry if he became more autonomous from her, which was equated with him becoming more masculine.
So if we move past the...
There's another description he gives that is maybe the same person, but I think maybe not, where it says that this mother was date raped as an adolescent and dealt with this by becoming promiscuous. Better to fuck than get fucked. She acknowledged that she hated men. The only maneuver this boy could use to be close to her was to comb her hair. She was a hairdresser. In our view, these kinds of pathological processes require a long time to work on in psychotherapy. Okay, that's not done.
That is done.
It's so I think this is just like so disturbing, right? You just see a mother who just is convinced based on her knowledge of her own child that she needs to be supported. And what we see from Zucker is like just this like trauma mining to find the reason why this woman is so ambivalent about masculinity, and then convince her that it's this that is causing it in her child.
This you've been mistreated by a man and that explains all your behavior is such a classic bullshit sexist stereotype of women, like in everything, every like treatment of women throughout history. It's like, oh, well, the reason that you want a vote is because one time a boy you like stood you up, or you were sexually assaulted by a man and that's why you're now a lesbian. It's all this kind of disgusting, and especially I know that when we're talking about sorry, I know we've done the hand wave. When we're talking about more extreme forms of sexual assault, it's sorry, Poppy pulled my headphones out. When it's more extreme form of sexual assault, it's a bit different, I guess. But like pointing to sexual assault in women as a reason they do something is ridiculous, because like most women have been sexually assaulted. So that means that all that happens is every time a woman does something you don't like, you're like, it's because of their sexual assault, because you can almost guarantee they've been sexually assaulted.
Yes.
So
it does sound like, and so there's another case where it was instead physical abuse by this woman's father, but it's just so if you come in wanting to support your kid, they were just like looking for like your sore spot, right? And like finding this kind of trauma and then presenting it to you as why your child has this problem that they are also presenting as like ruining your child's life. It's just like chilling, right? I think this is like, it's like 1960 again, and what we're doing in psychology is like putting our hands in people's heads and like messing around. It's just like it's just so disturbing. And
it's proper grim. We can take a time out if it's needed.
Jesse's so all of these kind of like bluish things are from Jesse's original piece.
I can't quite see it on the screen. The color.
Yeah, I made it very subtle, and I was like, it's probably won't be visible.
Okay.
So I think there's this very striking way of how he treats the clinicians who are very disturbed by what Zucker is doing to how he treats the clinicians at the GIC. So Leandra Miller is a clinician who felt that she ran a local support group for trans youth, and she felt like she could tell the ones that had been to the CAMH clinic before they told her. They were the ones with lasting shame problems. The younger they went, the deeper the shame. When I asked Miller to describe the problems she encountered in the 70 to 80 former GIC patients she said she had worked with over the years, she spoke for 7 minutes straight, listing an array of jaw-dropping charges. In addition to the photo stuff, which was them taking photos of children without consent, children were taught to be ashamed of themselves. The GIC drove a wedge between parents and children, and the GIC made its former patients too ashamed of their identities to seek out trans support services. He treats these as they are like jaw-dropping charges. The idea that like taking away all of a child's toys and everything they like, and whenever you see them doing something that is gender nonconforming, the parent rebukes them for it. The idea that that would drive a wedge between parents and children, it's like right there, right? This is not like a wild thing to think that the idea that children were taught to be ashamed of themselves. I mean, when you're teaching a kid that they can't do things,
they can't even draw their own imagination.
Right. Children think that the things they aren't supposed to do are bad, right?
Yep.
These things are just like, there's nothing fantastic about being concerned about these things as a result of what they were doing. What they were doing was just like very straightforwardly by descriptions, like very difficult. And in both of the descriptions we saw, the children were hiding stuff from their parents. They probably because he didn't want to show the pictures that was drawing. They would just saw them becoming secretive, as of course you would expect, I think. And the way Jessie treats these concerns, like, she spoke for 7 minutes straight. It's like as though the fact of her being very disturbed and concerned is like itself delegitimizing, right? And then he says that he challenges her, and he said that her theory was that sometimes GIC patients themselves didn't even know they'd been traumatized by the clinic, at least not at first. People made to feel ashamed at a young age, she explained, don't necessarily have the analysis of the reason they feel shame. It's because of different message they've been getting. How easy is it for people who are coming from that shame to actually voice complaints? So the realization that the GIC had harmed a given patient can, for some of those patients, only be accessed after they unpack their feelings. In the case of Miller's patients, presumably she would help them do the unpacking, help them realize that they were traumatized by the GIC, despite the fact that they themselves were unaware that traumatization had taken place. This is right, the idea that
it's like planting
children,
false memories, isn't it?
Yes,
that's the accusation.
Just the way shame works is that when you are made to feel ashamed about something, you don't think that like someone has wrongly shamed you about it. You think that they told you the truth about this bad feature of you. It's like, it's just totally normal for people, especially children, to not conceptualize it as them being wronged and being made to feel shame. And it's very striking the way Jessie treats this person's position compared to how he treats what someone says. So this is a GIC clinician explaining why they disagree with the idea that, so with some of these little children, they're like, unless someone intervenes, they like independently invent transitioning and self-transition, right? Like really little kids will, like all of the clothes they want to wear are like, little like assigned male kids will exclusively want to wear dresses. They will tell people that they're girls. They will tell people to call them by a girl name just on their own unless someone intervenes. Right? Some kids are just like themselves, do this. And it's just like with some of these kids, unless you are actively intervening and stopping them and telling them they can't do that, that's what they do. And so there's this thought of like, right, like let them do it. It's not a big deal if later they want to have a different kind of gender expression. The GIC clinicians say, I totally disagree with that, of the idea that detransitioning isn't a big deal. I say like these kids aren't getting any medical interventions. This is just like social presentation and how the child is presenting themselves to others. When kids socially transition, she explains, I mean, not just how the child is, right? When kids are supported, then their parents are also presenting the child this way. But the GIC clinician says detransitioning is a big deal because when kids socially transition, their parents not only become their champions, but also often start engaging in trans advocacy that comes to define them in important ways. If the child starts to sense that their gender dysphoria is desisting, they're faced with either sticking with a gender identity that no longer feels like it fits or telling the parents, as the clinician put it, this whole life that you've created for yourself as an advocate, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. There's also, of course, the fact that schools and family members are part of the process too. In this view, a too early transition really might limit a child's future options because of the social or familial cost of transitioning back. This is absurd. The idea that Zucker is getting the whole family engaged in this effort to make the child's gender identity match their biological sex, right? The parents in Zucker are invested. What they're invested in is making their child not be trans. The idea that it's absurd to think that that would make it harder for a child to then access trans care as an adolescent, that's an absurd claim. But that this is reasonable, that if a parent supports the child in their gender identity, the child might then think, oh, they won't support me if my gender identity changes.
That's contradictory, and also it's there's extra levels of bullshit, because the reason that the parents are shaming their kids into becoming cis is because they want to fix them, whereas the reason the parents are supporting their trans kids is because they want what's best for their child. And the parents who only want cis kids, whether you say I'm trans, or, whether you say I want to be a boy or a girl, just that's either good or bad based on what they want you to be. Whereas if you're a parent of a trans kid and your kid says, actually I'm a boy, actually I'm a girl, actually I'm non-binary, whatever, like that's not then changing. How am I explaining this? It's not like the parent of a trans girl is like, I want a girl. They're saying, I want a happy kid, and this is what I know is best for my kid. So if their kid then changes, then they can say, I want a happy kid, and this is what my kid wants. It's the same driver in both cases, whereas the driver for the other parents is forcing them into a box. Sorry, I don't know how well I explain that. I hope it was clear.
No, I mean, but you see this, people will portray the affirming approach as being like, I'm seeing this approach where you're like, I see my child, you're like, your true essence is that you are a girl. This is your like deep nature. This is permanent. We're doing it. People can do that. That does not have to be like the way you affirm your child's gender. And if you think that's a problem, that doesn't mean that the only response is like then telling them no.
Doing the exact same thing.
If you think it's important to like maintain flexibility around your child's gender self-conception, that maintaining flexibility is not going all in trying to produce a certain gender identity and gender expression, right? This is just, you just see all this like constant attempt to kind of conflate like and make disappear the fact that it is just radically different to have this kind of approach that tries to impose a specific gender identity or sexual orientation on someone. That it's just not similar to like anything else you might do. It's like, it just makes it the whole thing just so different. I think Jesse was like a very early like a trailblazer on this line, and I think was really influential in convincing people that this was science and this was what it was to be serious. And that
or at least teaching this excuse to people who want an excuse, because like the like, you're forcing my kid to be LGBT and I'm actually doing nothing wrong by forcing them to be cishet. Like, that's a standard LGBT phobic garbage that we've always had. But then for you to come out with like a respected journalist who's saying these respected scientists are saying this and it's actually good is the excuse people need. That's like the mainstreaming process rather than the mainstreaming of the desire, because I think the desire is there to force kids to be straight and cis.
Yeah, I get like the way he goes through this, like where the clinicians think that sexual orientation can't be changed, but gender identity can. Whereas Aaron Tevin, Olsen, Kennedy, and think that he glosses them as saying that they think even very young kids have a real gender identity inside them. I'm not sure if they would both totally agree that like every young child has a real gender identity, rather than like you just need to be affirming of what the child's doing and not directing. But then Jesse says there isn't any solid scientific evidence to support this view. So that doesn't preclude future discoveries, of course, about the affirming approach. The truth is that the CAMH Children's GIC was doing this for 40 years, and they failed to produce any evidence its methods were either effective or safe. This is, in Jesse's piece, he says, but there's some data which complicates the theory that the GIC was engaged in psychological brutality. For dissertation research, Tafita Singh cold called 113 former patients or parents for whom she could track down their current contact information. 70% agreed to come into the clinic to answer some follow-up questions, talk about their experiences, and so on. and another significant chunk provided at least some follow-up data. Singh argued in an email that such willingness to return to the clinic and to contribute to the research does not fit with the criticisms being made of the GIC. This is a completely inappropriate, I would say, unethical use of people's research participation, right? This is, so Singh wasn't, she was a student, but they were doing this for a long time and they did not produce any actual evidence showing that their intervention didn't cause psychological harm to the children. If we take what they published to be representative of everything they studied, that means that for 40 years, they were administering this treatment to children that many people, I think reasonably, considered likely to be harmful, that I think they could observe was very stressful for them, and they simply didn't look at the outcomes in any systematic way. To the extent that the only outcome they're interested in is whether they grow up to be trans, that's like kind of hard to measure, but like the short-term psychological well-being of children, that is something that you can study. Why do they not have any evidence that these kids are okay? They were doing this for a long time. It's not like this is new. And they were vacuuming up data. Like every child that came through, they did an exhaustive battery on. Like they were just like amassing so much data. It was a research clinic. They published a lot. They have like this paper of like physical attractiveness of girls with gender identity disorder.
That's a classic disgusting one.
Yes, they act as college students to judge whether these children are attractive. Mean age, 6.6 years. And physical attractiveness of boys. And they have like 10 papers on the finger length of their children. They have like 10 papers on birth order, and they don't have any papers on the outcomes, just the safety of what they're doing to children. These are children. And we're supposed to think, oh yeah, they should keep doing that.
It's unreal. God. Just to pick up on the point that we just missed past while I'm trying to process that last thing, saying that evidence that people going back to the clinic is evidence against the idea the clinic was bad. If someone rang me up and said, hey, you're a former patient of the NHS gender clinic in the UK, would you like to come in and answer some questions? I would be like, fucking hell, yes, I would, because I'm going to absolutely destroy it in the report that I get to write on this and tell every single person I get to meet how terrible it was. And then they'll be like, oh, Katy's turned up. Katy, that means she must have loved it. Joke. But yeah, on this idea that they haven't even, so they haven't published a paper about the mental wellness of these children that they're putting through this.
So I could find one paper that looks at an outcome so I looked only at Zucker's CV, and it is possible that something from the clinic, they published something that he wasn't an author on, but I'm not seeing them cite anything in
all of this. That should be like their main thing. They should say the evidence that this treatment doesn't, firstly, that it works and that it's safe and doesn't cause harm should I mean, that's what you always have to cite for supporting trans people is, citing that it's safe, citing that it's got long-term benefits, and citing that, that's the key thing. That's the thing you have to provide first.
Yeah, right. And so it's not as though they didn't notice that they needed evidence in this area, right? Like in, what year is this? 1990, he's saying like there's several therapeutic strategies, but there's not good data on which is best. In 2003, there's an urgent need for clinicians and researchers in the field to launch rigorous treatment outcome studies. Government now is, especially focused on here this is from the 2008 paper, he says, in the era of best practices, this means the highest standard of evidence, a properly designed randomized controlled trial has not been provided. But the evidence with his treatment isn't that there hasn't been this like phase 3 randomized controlled trial, right? We're talking about like phase 1, is this treatment safe? That has not been shown. They've been doing this to hundreds of children.
For 40 years?
Yes.
So this is an experimentation on children. Like when they're talking about, helping trans kids as some kind of experiment, this is like quite openly an experiment. Because there's no measurement of it. Like it was not even a real experiment. Because a real experiment, you take results down and make conclusions and stuff. It's just wild.
It's possible that they were right. It is normal for researchers to not publish their negative results. It's not normal for them to continue doing the treatment if they are only getting negative results. But what we see, I think, is that either they weren't systematically measuring the outcomes, including just the short-term psychological well-being of their patients in a way that then they could publish, or they were getting negative results that they weren't publishing. And in this 2013 paper, one of the questions that they're asked, they and the other people describing their treatments are asked to sort of how the relative risks and benefits of treatment are explained. Say benefits of treatment that we argue in favor of include the reduction in gender dysphoria, the attendant social ostracism that can ensue from gender identity disorder persistence, the complexity of sex reassignment surgery and its biomedical treatment, and the importance of reducing family psychopathology and stress. The risks of treatment are discussed. Perhaps the child will not respond to the treatment. Perhaps the parents will find it too stressful to attempt naturalistic interventions. Those are the risks. But
so no long-term psychological damage, permanent shame.
Right, like there's perhaps the parents will find it too stressful. Like the reason that in the patient accounts the parent accounts we were looking at, the reason the parents found it stressful is because of how upset their child was and was the impacts on their child. Why are we only talking about the parents finding it too stressful?
And again, like here, the benefits of this treatment are including, trans treatments are complex like that, and like, we'll just stop those, that's fine. Our treatment isn't complex, so that therefore it's better.
Yeah, and you see people now on this being like, it's so hard to design a phase 3 trial. We can't randomly assign transition to some kids, but there's other kinds where you can do cohorts that do other things, and also some of the outcomes that they seem to be pitching to parents. So both the Bradley and Sabrina cases, we see them talking about trying to help their social skills, the kids' social abilities. That is a short-term measure that you can try to study, right? You can give some kids whatever the standard practice would be for any child having social problems. And then you can take the other group's toys away, because they already were, and see how they do. That's a study you can do. Why didn't they do it? This thing says a child not wanting something nice to end is not the same as being traumatized by it. A parent would not simply extend the amount of time a child was watching TV because the child is upset, especially if the parent is making that decision in the best developmental interest of the child. They do not have evidence to say this. They should not be telling this to parents. It is not appropriate. There is no evidence in support of this idea that this is in the child's best developmental interest. This is a theory they have, that they have had a long time with many patients, which they were, I think disturbingly, repeatedly in their studies, they appear to be publishing data from all of their patients. One of the issues that comes up in the external review, they say that they need to be sure to get consent for treatment and consent for research participation on separate forums, which would be...
Oh, what? So there was the same signature?
The participation rate is extremely high, and they're not having a lack of data, right? They are just sucking up all this data, and then what they're publishing is are the trans kids left-handed?
Are they sexy at the age of 5? Disgusting. That's so vile. That measuring the physical attractiveness of children mean age 6 is just unreal. Actually incredible that this is somehow held up as some kind of person we should be listening to. Actually next level disgusting. Sorry, just on that last comment as well, the comparing the just descriptions we've just had of those 2 children where they're taking away their toys, taking away their friends, stopping them from even expressing their imagination by drawing, and they're comparing that to a kid wanting to watch TV for longer. What a disgusting, reductive thing to say. When you're crushing your child's imagination, you're not coming in and saying, stop watching the TV. You're saying, stop thinking. It's disgusting.
So this is the one thing that I could find that does look at an outcome. What they look at is just cross-gender behavior. This is from 1985. They find these children receive treatment. Only 13 got their treatment from CAMH, but they say in general, the treatment type is most closely approximated by that described by Green, which is like the sissy boys study, which is like pretty Zucker-esque. What they find is that the referred children either maintained or significantly reduced their cross-gender behavior. Degree of behavioral change correlates positively with the number of therapy sessions. As they note, it remains unanswered if the behavioral change represents simple conformity to the expectations of significant others. Does it reflect an acceleration of a natural burning out of cross-gender behavior? Or does it signify the beginning of an authentic shift in underlying cross-gender identification? This is in 1985. And then as far as I can tell, they simply move on from the questions of this. They're not looking at, this is just about their cross-gender behavior and not the outcomes that matter, right? And then they just seem to go silent on any kind of analysis of the outcomes they're getting from their treatment. It's troubling, right? Like,
troubling.
Yeah.
Horrifying.
Yeah, so I think Jesse talks in the piece about how like the hospital illegitimately intervenes to stop the progress of science. Like, when was science going to progress? When were they going to produce anything about what they were doing? Like, if everything was fine, this was a reasonable time to be like, okay, you need to stop doing this until you can like try to go analyze some data. Like, don't keep doing this until you can produce something. But yeah, this idea that this should just have been able to continue forever, because, and he says maybe things data, she's just talking about the fact of research participation, which is quite high. It's remarkably high, really. Maybe tripling high. They get really high participation rates for some of their follow-up studies, and it is like, why? But maybe things data leave something out. And the fact that some of the activists who helped write the external review, what he means by this is that they were interviewed and then their positions were accounted for. Some of the activists who helped write the external review viewed Dr. Zucker as Dr. Evil's more evil cousin. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong about the GIC having harmed its patients, of course. This is mocking. This is completely inappropriate about the seriousness of what's happening here. We are talking here about children receiving a completely unproven, pretty clearly acutely stressful treatment. And he says, but overall, it just wasn't easy to find direct evidence that the GIC was doing what its critics claimed. As I reported the story, I repeatedly emphasized to Pine, Russell, Miller, and Adam. So Pine is Jake Pine, who is who's a writer and a PhD student, was at the time a PhD student, and was doing like activism on these issues. But so Jesse repeatedly emphasized to them, all of whom are tapped into Ontario's LGBT activists and social networks in various ways, that it was important for me to get as many firsthand accounts of problems at the GIC as possible. These accounts failed to materialize. The idea that the way clinical practice works is that if the people thinking that you might be harming people, they have to be able to produce your patients that then are willing to talk to Jesse Singal and tell him that they've been harmed. And that is the standard for whether you get to keep doing this to children. This is just like a near delusional level of misunderstanding of the way clinical practice works. That it is the clinician who is doing something to his patients, especially to children, it's your job to show and to know that what you're doing is safe. Not to mention effective, right? We would hope that it would help them, but they don't have any serious evidence that they're not hurting them. We expect of clinical treatments evidence that it's not harmful, right? This isn't an unreasonable expectation being imposed on Ken Zucker. This is like the minimal expectation of anything that you're doing in clinical care. But then also, it seems that Jesse has wildly misrepresented the context of the clinic's closure. In particular, that 6 months before the clinic's closure, a bill called an Act to Amend the Health Insurance Act regarding efforts to change sexual orientation or gender identity was passed in Ontario that bans conversion therapy.
Good.
Yes. It specifies, says, no person shall, in the course of providing healthcare services, provide any treatment that seeks to change the sexual orientation of gender identity of a person under 18 years of age. The treatments mentioned in subsection 1 do not include services that provide acceptance, support, or understanding of a person, or the facilitation of a person's coping, social support, or identity exploration or development, and sex reassignment surgery, or any services related to that. Jesse does mention this in the piece in the context of, he says, it isn't entirely clear why activists' effort to shut down the GIC and oust Zucker came to a head last year, but it was likely a confluence of factors. 2015, a group from Rainbow Health Ontario brought their concerns to the CAMH. Jake Pine, this activist and scholar who helped lead the charge against the GIC, published an article that connected it to the high-profile, then recent suicide of Leila Acorn. There was an online petition calling for Zucker to be fired. And he says, and in the summer, Ontario passed Bill 77, legislation that made it illegal to provide any treatment that seeks to change the sexual orientation or gender identity of a person under 18 years of age. He says, although language exempting services that provide facilitation of a person's coping, social support, or identity exploration or development was inserted into Bill 77 and likely would have shielded the GIC from possible legal jeopardy, coverage of the legislation's debate and passage still helps spread allegations about the clinic. This idea that CAMH was feeling relaxed about what they were doing to children being likely legal and is just like institutionally illiterate with regard to like how hospitals operate, right? Likely legal for what you're doing this to children. And I think likely legal is bullshit. If we look at the debate around it, so this is Cherry DeNovo, who is tabling, which to me, tabling sounds like, I don't know, like pulling it, but she is introducing the bill to ban.
That's bringing it to the table, I think.
Yeah, she's bringing it to the table.
Yeah.
The people we see next to her here, on the left, this is Erica Muse, who testified. She is a former Zucker patient. What she is testifying about is her treatment at Zucker's clinic. Next to Erica is Jake Pine, who Jesse was just talking about leading the charge. What he is testifying about is how Ontario, he says, was ground zero in a debate that lasted for several decades regarding appropriate responses to children. He says he thinks the debate is over. And he says the minority of professionals who have declined to evolve their practices are the reason for this bill. Cherry DeNovo, quote says, there are still doctors practicing in Ontario paid by OHIP, just like their public insurance, who think being LGBT is a form of mental illness. They are telling parents to fix their trans daughters by taking away their Barbies, cutting their hair, and stopping them from playing with other girls. That's familiar, right? That sounds like a description of Kenneth Zucker's practices. When asked if the bill was targeting Zucker, she said it was not based on the work of just one practitioner. In the review, we see Zucker says he feels the work of the GIC would not fall under Bill 77, though it's possible parents may misinterpret it to refer to our work. But then we also see the trainees worried that it'll have a chilling effect on the work. And we see that the legal team presented a confidential brief on the bill. Say it's Appendix 10. This is one of the few things that was not released in the public report. So this bill is a problem if they were doing conversion therapy on anyone, right? If it doesn't matter, it doesn't count if you are facilitating some people's identity exploration, if you're doing conversion therapy on other people. The way the bill works is that patients can bring complaints. And I think this is the idea that it's like, oh, it's part of these exempted services. I think that is like how Zucker or other people at CAMH would defend themselves. I think there's little reason to think from the face that it what they're doing falls into that, right? The idea that this kind of treatment that is directed by the parents' wishes, that essentially takes away from the child all of the things they are using to express their gender, right? It essentially involves restricting their gender expression, right? That's not identity exploration. It just seems like straightforwardly.
Yeah, it's just
what they were doing falls under the ban.
Yeah. And if you brought in a ban on conversion therapy and it didn't stop you from like taking away a child's friends in an effort to force them to be a cis kid, then the ban's rubbish. Like that, it uncontroversially should cover that kind of disgusting practice.
What we see from Zucker's allies around the bill is they seem to think that it covers what he's doing and leading up to the passage. So the language around the exemption was added towards the end. I mean, if you look at it, it does not seem like it is made to exempt things that are in fact conversion therapy, right? It's like clarifying language. It's like these like positive accepting services do not fall into that. It's not like, oh, if you're doing conversion therapy but can kind of construe it as identity exploration, that's cool. That is, right? It's at least on like very flimsy ground, and also anything like from the hospital's perspective, it's just incredible the idea that this wasn't a major factor in the hospital's decision, right? Even if they thought, which I think they should not have, but I am a philosopher, not a lawyer, but even if they thought that they could win these cases, it would be ugly, right? It would be like hospital apparently doing conversion therapy, but wins by a thread. Like that. And what we see, so these are mostly written before the language, this exemption for these positive services was added. But so child psychiatrist Susan Bradley, who founded the clinic, and you Bell, she says, the trans lobby has got us on the run. Kenneth Zucker has been forbidden to speak with the media, but Dr. Bradley no longer has a formal relationship with CAMH. Ray Blanchard says, the real intent of the bill is prohibiting clinicians from helping grade school kids to accept and value their anatomic sex. Bradley again says, she considers Bill 77 disgraceful. She wanted to testify to the Justice Committee. I don't think that happened, but she believed it was a charade even having the public meeting, since Minister of Health Eric Hoskins had been unresponsive to our efforts to have a discussion about the complexity of the situation. So Eric Hoskins' thing is interesting. Originally, he thought that like this wasn't happening in Ontario, and then after speaking to people involved, he was like, "This is happening."
I hope that the British politicians involved in this talk to some of the kids who have faced it, because I don't know, I just see this playing out again, but less in our favour here. So
yeah, and then she said that the bill infringed on patient and parents' rights. Alice Drager wrote this piece. This piece, I think, is probably written after the language was added. Ray Blanchard wrote this piece saying, it's sought for ideological reasons to prohibit or penalize clinical interventions that are in the best interests. And he has not and he did not seem to change his mind about this after the exemption was added, right? So he's still saying in 2019, this was his futile attempt to protest legislation that prohibits therapists from encouraging gender dysphoric children to accept their anatomic sex. There was little to no conversion therapy of gays and lesbians happening in Ontario in 2015. Therefore, I think the bill was a Trojan horse primarily intended to prevent therapists from helping gender dysphoric children accept their anatomic sex.
It's just a way of rephrasing target, like what I was doing was conversion therapy. Like
yeah. He says, conversion therapy laws are Trojan horses, essentially about banning attempts to change sexual orientation in adults. Ken Zucker quote tweets him and says, my colleague Ray Blanchard is dead on about this. In fact, if one reads legislations carefully, one will see that many don't even pertain to adults or anyone who can give informed consent. In other words, if you're able to give informed consent, you can ask a clinician for pretty much anything. So in reality, the activists and clinician activists are targeting very young children, and that exploring gender dysphoria with young children and their families is risky business. They are now considered criminalizing this. Well, I guess in 2020 they were. I don't know what happened. But he testified related to they were going to criminalize it at the national level. Zucker says, my point about Bill C6, it it's very similar to all prior legislation, including Bill 77 in Ontario, is that there's this does not apply clause. This is it does not include practices that relate to a person's exploration of their identity. That is a completely vague descriptor, does not give clinicians clear guidance on what is considered acceptable in terms of exploration. I think that's a fundamental problem. It's frightening to parents because they worry that they're going to be accused of taking their kids to conversion therapy. I've seen a group at a conference talking about this, and another clinician telling him that he's never felt that what he's doing might be construed as conversion therapy, right? This idea that the idea that's ambiguous whether you can include this stuff in identity exploration is based on wanting to include conversion therapy in identity exploration.
Yeah, just trying to sneak it past. And
but yeah,
just commenting on something that was just previous, I think was from Blanchard, where they say oh well, this bill is targeted at us because there isn't any conversion therapy for gay people going on. It's it said conversion therapy is bad for gay people and trans people, and you're you're opposing the bill because there isn't conversion therapy against against gay people going on. Well, it's good to outlaw it anyway because it's still disgusting, but that's kind of the whole point, is there is trans conversion therapy still going on. I don't even think they've done good dodges here. It's not even a competent way of shuffling out the way to make it look like you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think the overall point I want to make is that this claim Jesse makes that they probably were shielded by this exemption and they probably didn't fall under it, I think is really not plausible. I think it's not in line with the way the progress of this actually worked. And I think it just allows him to kind of radically misrepresent what happened. So his piece is called "How the Fight Over Transgender Kids Got a Leading Sex Researcher Fired." And an alternative hypothesis, which I think is plausible, is how a ban on conversion therapy got a leading sex researcher fired, because it seemed to fall under conversion therapy. Yeah. It's just, right, I think what happened here, CAMH was in a bad situation, right? They had been having their guy do this for 40 years on children, and now seemingly based on what he was doing, seemingly motivated by that, conversion therapy has been banned. So what are they going to do? Are they going to come out and be well, we've been doing conversion therapy, but now it's illegal, so we have to stop? They're in a bad spot, right? And so I think that these things in Jesse's piece where he says oh, it's a show trial, I think that's probably true, right? I think that probably they were looking for an excuse that wasn't this guy has, to our knowledge, been doing conversion therapy for a long time, and now that's illegal, so we have to make him stop. And they were trying to find this external reason to stop it. But Jesse approaches it as though the working assumption is that the report is the report that CAMH commissioned was trying to produce what was trying to represent what was happening at CAMH in the worst possible light. CAMH wants to maximally demonize what was happening at their hospital. And this is deeply confused about the way institutions work. This is where he's talking about how even before Science of Us, which was him, CAMH was attempting to de-emphasize the review's importance. Last month, I asked Kwame McKenzie, the hospital's Bell director, about the decision to shut down the GIC, to explain a very confusing chart in the document that seems to accuse the GIC of potentially engaging in reparative type activities, but in such a vague way that it's hard to understand what's going on. All right, this is the chart. They reviewed 12 patients' charts, and then they have this chart where they report on what they found in this review. As you can see, one of the things they looked for was whether statements could be seen, whether the chart included statements that could be seen as reparative type, and they find for 4 of the charts, yes, there were statements they thought could be seen as reparative type. I don't feel confused by this chart, but I was going to say, the hospital's medical director of underserved populations told Jesse he wasn't sure what the chart meant, but suggested it was time to move on from the external review. You're trying to understand the chart in detail, and we're all moving on and trying to do something else, he said, telling me he'd checked to see if the reviewers themselves had time to decrypt the chart for me. I never heard back. So the hospital does not want to give Jesse Singal details about the statements in the chart that could be seen as reparative type. To Jesse, this is evidence that it's not real. I think to a person with a normal understanding of how institutions operate, it instead is probably the hospital not wanting to give more details about something bad.
Patient data, yeah.
But not just patient data, but like, this is bad. There was a ban on conversion therapy. They're not giving details about the conversion therapy that was happening there. And there are also details about in some of the report where they say we cannot state that the clinic does not practice reparative approaches. They are like pussyfooting here, right? Jesse presents this as them like falsely suggesting that like leaving it illegitimately open that they're practicing reparative approaches when there's no evidence they are. But in reality, if you look at it, they're just like not making the full statement when what they have, I think, is pretty straightforward, them doing reparative approaches, right? Like they talk then about how in one of the charts, the clinician describes the parent as not going to fight nature, but more than willing to nurture to facilitate the development of becoming a boy. That's probably one of the examples of the reparative type statements.
Yeah.
And then this just in Jesse's hands becomes based on this inexplicable assumption that this hospital was trying to produce the most damning possible description of what they were doing at the hospital. It's like, oh, so it must be false. He points out that, so now this guy is telling him that like, it wasn't just the review. And he's like, but Mackenzie used to think the external review was important. He initially was saying, oh, well, we've had this review and we've learned that this is happening and it takes an external review to do things properly. And this is, what happened around the report, I think, was genuinely it seems like because of this false claim, they did kind of like mistreat Kenneth Zucker in a way. But the idea that this is evidence that nothing bad was happening is just I have this helpful slide describing the institutional scandal playbook, which is what institutions do when there's a scandal is they minimize what happened, they circumscribe it, they portray it as an isolated problem, and then, if necessary, they sacrifice one person or a few, and then they want to portray it as like, this was a matter of individual bad actors. It's not a deep institutional problem. It was these individuals, and now they're out. That is exactly what looks like happened here, right? I think CAMH knew what was happening probably in that, like, their IRB kept approving the studies Zucker was doing. Zucker was publishing all this stuff. It's not like they didn't know the approach, but then we get this report that's like this external report looking at whether it's happening, and then on the basis of that, it's going to be fired. It seems like they're looking for a reason that they didn't already know to fire him. But this doesn't mean bad things weren't happening. It means that the institution doesn't want dirty hands. It's just like, CAMH's hands are dirty in this, right? It's not like Zucker was just like this rogue wolf that no one knew what was happening for 40 years. People knew what was happening and they were allowing it. And I think that it's worked, honestly. I think it's just like not gotten the kind of scrutiny that would be appropriate. Because I think when CAMH found itself in a situation where their clinician had been doing what is, according to standard definitions, classified, would be considered conversion therapy for 40 years, and now it was banned. And then it turned out that, courtesy of Jesse Singal, what they got in trouble for was firing that clinician. I would bet that they were surprised. I think that they thought they were in a very bad situation with regard to something else, which was what actually had been happening. And there's just so many, looking at looking at the research, there's so many things that are like odd and troubling to me. And the fact that instead of like real journalistic scrutiny, what happens was like this guy thinking that like because the hospital's report isn't like completely specifically damning about what they themselves via Kenneth Zucker were doing, there must actually not have been a serious problem despite all published papers. And
it's like we've been doing this thing for years that's just been made illegal, so we're just going to admit that we've been doing that, or maybe we can just like shoo one person out the door and pretend it never happened. Yeah, and
it worked. It worked. I think this piece is misleading to its core. Right? It's not just that and it sucks because I think, I can't know for sure what happens. I'm on the outside, but I'm looking at like what led up to it, the legal changes that were happening, and it just very much seems like what happened was legislators felt like there had to, because this wasn't being dealt with on like a professional level, even though people were testifying at in this bill's debate that like conversion therapy would be considered professional malpractice already, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing was being done to stop people from doing these approaches that they had no reason to think were safe. And then conversion therapy was banned, and shortly after it was stopped.
Yeah.
And so I think this should have been kind of a ending point to this, right? It should have been like, this practice was stopped.
Stop with the law designed specifically to target it. Yeah.
And instead, what we get is this high-profile obfuscation around whether this was ever conversion therapy at all. And it's fucked up. I think this was really influential, and it's just so, it's the worst. So this is why, this is the reason today that I'm angry with Jesse Singal.
Thanks for going through all of that, because there's so much research.
So mad.
There is so much.
Mad.
It's so horrible. Like it's kind of overwhelming. I'm like, so I didn't sleep much last night, and my brain's in a bit of a haze, and I half think that's bad, but half think that's good that I haven't been able to absorb how like horrifying lots of this is, and what the magnitude of it is. Like all of that treatment, and I didn't realise that it was for 40 years. That's just harrowing.
I think it's just like such a striking, I don't know, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a clinical researcher, but it just looks like they were able to do stuff to trans kids that they would never have been able to get away with doing to cis kids, and not just trans, gender nonconforming kids. And it's that until 2015, they were doing this treatment that seems like it was this acutely stressful to these, they're little kids, right? They're so small, and like, it's just awful.
Reading that piece about the kid who's called Bradley in the piece, just broke me. Like when I remember reading it a while ago actually, and really struggling with it, and then I rediscovered it this week, probably when you posted it, and it's just too much. Like it's like a psychological horror film or something. The idea that the people in your life who have control over you come for everything that you own and everything that you care about, and then the one thing you have left is like painting, and then they come for that too. And that's like then the parents are like distressed at how much pain it's caused. Like every parent knows what pain caused to their child, and they're seeing it, and then these experts are saying, no, this is for the greater good, this is going to perform, this is going to work. And they didn't know that. How could they have possibly said they know it's going to work, it's not going to cause harm, when, like you say, where's the studies showing that it doesn't cause harm? What's that based on? It's just saying keep on doing something is harming your kid because we think it's for the best. Like, it's just beyond.
I think it's just like chilling that this was happening for so long, and that now it has just kind of drifted away like a cloud when people in the trans community in turn, I think you see Jesse portrays them as having mass hysteria over this.
I wonder why, like if they've, like, so many of them must have been through it and know people personally who's been through it. Like, to call it like mass hysteria when we, like, there's just reports on it happening, like it's some next level gaslighting. But no wonder all of the people who live there and went through this have, I mean, potentially even hysterical views. If you have been forced through this as a child, and we're saying that, conversion therapy can negatively affect people long term, then I mean, that doesn't, it's going to be horrible. It doesn't mean it's not bad just because people have a terrible view of this. Like, even if it's, I don't know.
This one, Jesse had other clinicians telling him that the kids who came out of this were not okay. And his response was to mock them. I put this in just because it makes me so mad. It's this stupid email from this fancy journalist listserv they had. And Jesse says,
right.
Almost every step of the way, I found that on these specific issues, the biggest name trans activists simply led me in the wrong direction, whether it's on desistance or what was going on in the Zucker clinic. Time and time again, my reporting and research conflicted with what they've told me. Overall, no, I don't think trans people are more qualified to write about the tricky science stuff going on here than I am. I'd just be lying if I said otherwise. Jesse Singal does not appear to understand science. The idea that what happened in this piece, and his narrative is like, oh, well, he was just too serious about the science. And he looked at the science and this is what it told him. And he's like a serious, rational science man. And he didn't think, why are there no published results that show this is safe or effective? Get out of here.
It's just, and I really, like, I just see this so much where they're like, big name trans activists, which don't represent most trans people. Most trans people agree with me is kind of implied in what I'm saying. And then just like, how can we possibly say trans people would know more than I do about the things they experience in their life from literally every medical professional they've ever encountered? Like, also
the one of the trans activists who he thinks led him the wrong direction about Zucker was Julia Serrano, who was literally a scientist, not this. Yeah, that's the way you can always when you say trans activist, it's there's so many ways that you can use that to delegitimize people, like particularly trans people. It's like, I saw them saying that about the people who went and talked at the Gender Recognition Act reform panel. I can't remember what the official name of it was, but one of them is like doctor, a doctor in this kind of thing, and then they're just like, oh, a trans activist spoke in Parliament today. It's like, no, she's a qualified doctor with like experience in this actual field, and the doctors that you got in opposing are doctors of philosophy and doctors of law, and not doctors of this. It's so infuriating. Sorry, ranting a bit. No, Yeah, so long story short, Jesse Singal writes this dumbass piece where he says that it's this like outrage that these trans activists have persecuted this poor clinician by running him out of the clinic where he had merely done a treatment on children to hundreds of children that there are good reasons to think is harmful to the children, and had nothing to show that it was safe. That this is like this hysterical intervention instead of like the way we expect, like intervening in a clinician treating children in a way that is just way below the standards that we expect a clinician to treat children with.
I wonder if, like, I know that, yeah, me too. I wonder if this is the kind of thing, like, I'm not an expert in this, that, can these people who survived through this, can they bring like some kind of class action lawsuit against the people doing it? Because like it does, I know that it's experts and hospitals and doctors often have to like get you to sign these consent forms when it's like experimental treatment like this, but there's still like restrictions on it. You can't just do something at random to someone. That's immoral. You still need the basic things like this isn't going to harm someone. You need to have done some kind of risk assessment and stuff. You're not just signing your life away to someone to do anything they want when you sign a consent form.
Yeah, I think there are in the public. I think they're very troubling. Things that like parents say, seemingly about the representations that were made to them by the clinic. That it seems like they just didn't have good reason to support. Right? This is like the near absence of verifiable complaints in the report, and then anonymous clinicians say that patients are traumatized, that GIC clinicians performed cognitive and psychological testing without obtaining proper consent. This is not, I think, a tenacious claim. This thing that they were performing, this testing without proper consent, because when I look at the research, they have for like all of their patients done an IQ test on them. I think this is not a clinically justified thing to do based on what's in what the external report says is that they like need to inform patients that this is not standard practice. But they're doing it, and it seems like they're doing it to get research data. And the fact that they are getting it from apparently all of their patients makes it seem it's like a reasonable assumption that proper consent things are not happening. Like if everyone has like totally transparent, it makes it troubling, right? Like who knows? Maybe their patients are just super, super willing to participate in treatment and spend hours taking an IQ test. But it's troubling. All this stuff is troubling. There's so much that's troubling about it. And the idea that a journalist looked into this and thought that the disturbing thing that happened at CAMH was the fact that Kenneth Zucker was fired, it's absurd.
Yeah.
Jesse Singal is bad at his job.
At best. That's the best interpretation of this, I think.
I'm sorry, once again, I've talked for so long. It's because I put so much text.
No, I it's not just a lot of text though. It's a lot of research, and I think that's really, I think it's really important to present. I was actually going to say, I know we normally do questions, but I don't know if I have the energy to do them today, and maybe we can just do next episode. We can, make sure we do take questions from people. No, I really appreciate the amount of like research you've done for this, and I think it's really important to show people. And
I just want to. Jesse gets so much mileage out of this, like what he said to Jude was like, provide documentation. This guy spends like hours on Twitter telling people who are describing his work in accurate ways, which is that this piece is defending conversion therapy, right? One way of defending conversion therapy, notably, is denying that it's conversion therapy.
Yeah. I think that's like the main way.
So the fact that he denies it's conversion therapy obviously does not mean he doesn't defend conversion therapy. And Jesse, like, explain how this is not conversion therapy. Specifically, give a specific definition of gender identity conversion therapy that is real and normal and doesn't include this. Joke.
Yeah, there's not going to be any big organizations, and just in advance, LGB Alliance are not a big medical organization who are going to come out with any kind of definition for conversion therapy for trans people that doesn't include this. That's not going to be a thing. I think that like one of the good things about showing this is, people now see, these pieces can be very opaque. Like you see this and you see all these quotes and stuff, and there's he's written a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of links, and there's so many different things to reference, and you really need to know where to look. And you've collected together all of these things where here are some of the papers which explain what they do. And that's just, here is them saying, we did a conversion therapy. So now that is the important part to focus on when confronting people who have got their ideas from articles claiming that there's no conversion therapy. So
yeah, one of the perennial things you get from Jesse defenders is they're like, well, I don't know anything about this topic, but I've read his piece and it seemed to me like it was presenting a neutral perspective.
Yeah,
I think in fact there are things in this piece that should make you be like, such as the idea that it likely was legal, and let's move on. The idea that these people's opponents are conceptually confused about sexual orientation and gender identity. There's a lot of red flags, but yeah, like there's just so much dust is thrown up around this, and it's hard to.
Yeah.
Also, unblock me, Jesse. If you are going to sit around and constantly claim that you want to talk to your opponents who can produce evidence and explain to you what their problem is, and then you turn around and you block the people who
are doing that,
produce evidence for you and explain to you what the problem is, scam. On that note.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, I'll talk to you more about this afterwards. I was just going to say it'd be good to get this like research thing out in some way that people can look, but obviously no rush and all this kind of stuff. And this has been another heavy episode of the Six Factor. We've done some really heavy stuff on this series, and I really appreciate everyone sticking around and just learning about it, because I think we're okay. Sorry. I think we just potential tech issue avoided. I've changed, so it's okay. I think that people knowing about this is the most important thing, because you can tell other people about this, and this fight is still going on. They've outlawed it in. I don't actually know the status of it in Canada in general, but I guess they've outlawed it everywhere, or just in Ontario, or.
And at least many provinces now have similar bans, and I am not sure what happens with the federal.
Right. So Australia's got a similar thing. They've outlawed it in one or more states, but not in federal level or whatever it's called. And the UK is considering this is like one of the frontline fights for trans rights right at the moment in lots of the world, or in I guess like Western countries. And it's just important to be informed of this, because I feel like it's not a culture war thing. This is like a trans rights issue that somehow isn't so culture war. The culture war is about trans kids getting treatment, but the legal battle is over banning conversion therapy. And banning conversion therapy is a huge win for all LGBT people.
I think that one thing that comes out in it's like, this is a question of like, do you think that basic standards of clinical ethics that apply everywhere else also apply to gender nonconforming children or not? Like, these are just normally basic features are like not doing any harm, right? Are like being cautious in the things that you're doing and doing to like not harm children, not doing these things that are acutely harmful and don't have like I think that like by it's like all accounts it's like acutely stressful for many families, and this is just normal clinical ethics don't allow this, and there's just a blind spot that people have that some people are fighting to continue this blind spot where just normal ethics of like your patient being the focus and not their parents' wishes for how they want their life to go. And like first and foremost, it's important to not harm people.
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know. It's pretty grim.
So
yeah,
I think a legitimate grievance to have with Jesse.
Yeah, and also with the Zucker Blanchard Bailey crew, which are still very they're very influential in the gender critical movement. A bit more sidelined because they provide this cover for the push against trans kids, but they're not fighting the culture war. which is what Gender Critical is mainly about. But yeah, you know, it's important to know about this stuff. But yeah, I guess we could rant. I think we could carry on ranting it forever, and perhaps we should stop now because this has been a good length episode. But yeah, thank you very much everyone for sticking around. I really appreciate it.
Thank you guys.
If, you know, I know it's a long episode, but either, you know, share it with people who you think this is relevant to. I'm not like just trying to do a like, share and subscribe, but like, you know, this conversion therapy stuff is important. It's important in the UK, it's important in the US, it's important in Canada, it's important in, you know, so many different countries. And, you know, don't necessarily have to share this episode, find out this research and just, you know, we need to tell people, because I don't think people realise how disgusting this is and how widespread the defence of it is. So, but yeah, anyway, thank you very much, everyone. I know I've said that like 5 times. Lots of love to all of you, and try and have a mental detox after this because it's been a heavy episode. Yeah.
Thank you guys for watching.